Good morning and welcome. The Subcommittee on the Federal Workforce, Postal Service in the District of Columbia hearing will now come to order. I want to welcome my colleague and friend, Ranking Member Chaffetz, and members of the subcommittee, hearing witnesses, and all those in attendance. The purpose of today's hearing is to examine what steps the Postal Service has taken and plans to take since Congress passed the Postal Accountability and Enhancement Act, PAEA. I'll try to keep the acronyms to a minimum, to use its increased flexibility to grow revenue. Furthermore, we are here to discuss barriers or limitations to the Postal Service's innovations, and what lessons can be learned from foreign posts in this area. The Chair, Ranking Member, and the Subcommittee each will have 5 minutes to make an opening statement, and all members will have 3 days to submit statements for the record. Ladies and gentlemen, I will yield myself such time, 5 minutes for my opening statement. In the series of hearings the Subcommittee has held on the Postal Service thus far this year, the discussion has tended to focus on the Postal Service's bottom line or its cost-cutting and consolidation efforts, and rightfully so, as the past 2 fiscal years have presented some significant financial challenges for the nation's mail system. However, today the subcommittee convenes not to discuss what the Postal Service has been doing to reduce expenditures, but more so to learn about what the organization is doing to grow revenue and the overall value of mail as part of an ongoing effort to bring about fiscal turnaround. Today, almost 3 years since the passage and enactment of the landmark Postal Accountability and Enhancement Act, we look forward to hearing what exactly has been done to grow the business under the new price flexibilities and product innovations afforded to the Postal Service in 2006. First, however, I must briefly acknowledge the financial reality before us. The Postal Service expects a net loss of approximately $7 billion for fiscal year 2009. Prior to accounting for the recent legislation in the form of a $4 billion deferred payment to the Retiree Health Benefit Fund. I'm pleased Congress was able to grant the Postal Service authority to defer a share of its retiree health benefits prepayment, which allowed the organization to meet its financial obligations and improve its cash position. However, as my friends from both sides of the aisle acknowledged last month, the relief measure was only a temporary solution to a host of long-term problems. Moreover, I would like to note that this was not a bailout. Many Americans think the Postal Service is largely supported by federal government dollars. It is not. This is an important point I want to stress. The Postal Service is over 99% self-supporting, with less than 1% of its funds provided by the federal government to support important things like mail for the blind and overseas voting. Again, that's less than 1%. Additionally, up until postal reform, the Postal Service operated under the so-called break-even mandate, preventing the organization from even making a profit. Post-PAEA, I'm trying to stay away from these acronyms. The Postal Accountability and, what is it again? Enhancement Act. However, the Postal Service is now permitted to operate more like a business in terms of profit earning and product diversification. To that end, I look forward to hearing from today's witnesses on the extent to which the Postal Service has attempted to grow its business, from the novel summer sale to the offering of flat-rate boxes and holiday greeting cards. Today's hearing is intended to examine the steps that the Postal Service has taken and the results achieved so far in the area. In looking to the future, Postmaster General Jack Potter recently described several initiatives the Postal Service is potentially interested in to diversify and grow revenue. He observed that the Postal Service has more retail outlets in the United States than McDonald's, Starbucks, and Walmart combined. Perhaps surprisingly to some, he proposed that the Postal Service should be permitted to offer its customers alternate services such as banking, insurance, and telecommunications. Given past experiences and the extreme caution required when enterprising a business, I'm interested in hearing the extent to which these newly proposed ideas have been vetted, as well as what risks have been evaluated. Further, I have asked today's witnesses to address what lessons can be learned from foreign posts in the area of product and service development and diversification. I know that some foreign posts, such as those in Japan and France, offer banking services and sell mobile phones, for example. However, I also know that several countries have privatized their postal services, while the U.S. Postal Service remains an independent federal establishment of the United States government. In the coming months, our subcommittee will continue to provide close oversight of the Postal Service, including an in-depth examination of the Postal Service's business model, to help determine which longer-term changes are necessary to help the Postal Service return to financial viability. The Postal Service undoubtedly needs to move forward with its efforts to grow its revenue and increase the value of mail, perhaps even more so than focusing on cutting costs or reduce its retiree health benefit obligations. I thank each of you for being with us this morning. I look forward to your participation, and I yield for 5 minutes to the ranking member, Mr. Chaffetz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for agreeing to hold this very important discussion. My comments will be brief because we came to listen and hear from this panel. But let me just concur and echo the sentiments as the Chairman articulated, because I think he has it exactly right. We will obviously spend time and attention talking about cost-cutting measures, but at the end of the day, we need to increase the relevancy of the United States Postal Service. In order for it to thrive and to serve the citizens of the United States of America, we need to increase its relevancy. At the same time, I think there needs to be caution in making sure that we're not tripping on top of the private sector and maybe with good intentions, maybe some unintended consequences, competing in a space that is probably best left to the private sector. Yet the United States Postal Service under our Constitution has a unique place in this country, and I'd like to see us do more. One of the things in particular that I think we should pay attention to, what is the cross-functionality that we can take advantage of with other segments within government. One, for instance, that I would like to see us continue to pursue is the conducting of the United States Census, something we do every 10 years. They're given $14 billion in order to execute it. We have real estate. We have very able people. Again, something that I think we should continue to pursue. What are the things that we can do with FEMA? What are the things we can do with other government agencies that need the types of resources that are uniquely provided by the United States Postal Service? So I look forward to your comments. I appreciate the Chairman's approach on this as well, and I hope this is the start of a series of dialogues about the potential impact and the potential new openings and increased relevancy for the United States Postal Service. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
Thank you. I know the gentleman has recently arrived. I would like at this point to yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from North Virginia, Mr. Conley, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for holding this hearing on the long-term viability of the Postal Service. This is precisely the type of process we should be conducting in order to determine those changes that will enable the Postal Service to thrive in the future. In general, we should be wary of short-term cost-cutting measures that could reduce Postal Service market share and revenue in the future, such as a shift, for example, to 5-day mail delivery. Instead, it would be preferable, from my point of view, to examine changes that enable the Postal Service to augment its existing sources of revenue. I'm pleased the Postal Service is examining 15 new revenue sources that could complement mail service. These changes should not be limited to marginal changes. For example, perhaps it would be possible for the Postal Service to work in partnership with community banks to integrate banks and post offices in a manner that would help both existing community banks and the Postal Service itself. The goal of exploring these new revenue options should be to preserve the outstanding services offered by the Postal Service. We all benefit from affordable and convenient mail delivery. The ability of the Postal Service to deliver mail quickly in 6 days of the week not only protects our constituents' quality of life, but also creates opportunity for businesses that rely on mail for advertising or product distribution. If the Postal Service did not exist, there is little doubt that the mailing market would have characteristics with negative implications for affordability and consumer choice. The Postal Service continues to play an important role limiting the prices of sending mail and packages, which helps all consumers. The Postal Service also makes an important contribution to our economy. Approximately 615,000 people work for the Postal Service, generally earning high union wages, or fairly high union wages. During the Bush administration, for the first time in history, median wages for American families actually fell during a full economic cycle of expansion, recession, and recovery. Protecting high-paying blue-collar jobs such as those provided by the Postal Service must be part of our broader efforts to help the economy recover. Thanks again, Chairman Lynch, for holding this important series of hearings on the long-term viability of the Postal Service, and I look forward to hearing from our panel.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Cummings, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I, too, thank you for holding this critically important hearing on adapting the Postal Service to our changing world. The United States Postal Service is the second largest civilian employer with approximately 623,000 career employees. Although consumers rank the Post Office as one of the most trusted government agencies, and it continues to excel, the Post Office has not been immune to the downward economic trends currently facing our nation. While final numbers are not available yet, it is estimated that the Post Office will experience a $6.2 billion loss, which is over 2 times more than last year's loss. This loss can be attributed largely to 2 factors. Number one, the unprecedented decline in mail volume due to increased use of electronic communications and other factors. And 2, the economic recession that is affecting all sectors. The Postal Service has been making a number of aggressive cost-cutting measures, but I'm interested in hearing about the new innovative ideas our panelists will present today. The Postal Accountability Enhancement Act was signed into law in December of 2006, allowing for flexibility in how services are designed, priced, and marketed. Because of that flexibility, the Post Office has been able to create new innovative programs, such as the Standard Mail Volume Incentive Pricing Program this past summer. The summer sale provided a 30% rebate to eligible mailers on letters volume above a specific threshold. This program is estimated to have generated at least $50 million in sales. The Postal Service has also restructured its website and created mobile device functionality for its customers. This allows greater accessibility and added convenience for postal users. For 44 cents, we can send a letter anywhere in the United States. We all would have to admit that's a pretty good bargain. Post Office is and continues to be reliable and a great value. I look forward to the discussion today about expanding services and non-postal products directly or in partnership with private sector entities, and what Congress can do to help the United States Postal Service. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank you. Yeah. The chair now recognizes the distinguished gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and let me just echo the sentiments that have already been expressed by my colleagues in thanking you for calling this hearing. I think that the Postal Service is one of those critical elements of our communication system that must be seriously addressed, and so I'm eager to hear an analysis of the impact of the efforts that have been put forth by Postmaster General Potter and his staff and the other entities associated with trying to make sure that we maintain the viability of our postal operation. When I think of what we are facing with the impact of electronic communication and all of the other economic indicators that are upon us, we recognize that it is no easy task and that there are no simple solutions to very complex issues. But I want to commend you for your leadership as chairman of this subcommittee and how you have been moving things along to try and help assure that our postal operations will continue as viable instruments of our communication system. So I want to thank you very much and look forward to hearing the witnesses.
I thank the gentleman for his kind words. What I'd like to do is, it's the custom of this subcommittee to swear its witnesses before they provide testimony. May I invite you to stand and please raise your right hand? Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you will give before this subcommittee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Let the record show that all of the witnesses, each of the witnesses has answered in the affirmative. What I'd like to do now is just offer brief introductions of our panel of witnesses. Mr. Robert Bernstock was named President of Mailing and Shipping Services, a new division at the U.S. Postal Service, in June 2008. He is responsible for development and management of all retail and commercial products for the Postal Service, including commercial sales and services. Mr. Bernstock has extensive senior leadership experience with Campbell Soup Company, Scott's Miracle Grow, and Vlasic Foods, among others. The Honorable Ruth Goldway was designated chairman of the U.S. Postal Regulatory Commission by President Barack Obama on August 6, 2009, and has served with the agency since 1998. She's an experienced regulatory and public affairs professional with expertise in citizens' participation, consumer issues, urban planning issues, as well as the mailing industry. Mr. Michael Coughlin is a recent retiree from Accenture, a global consulting technology and outsourcing firm where he helped to manage senior-level relationships with postal clients around the world. Mr. Coughlin also spent 32 years with the United States Postal Service, serving as Deputy Postmaster General and member of the Board of Governors from 1987 to 1999. Mr. Phil Hare is Director of the Physical Infrastructure Team at the Government Accountability Office. Since joining GAO in 1989, he has managed reviews of a broad range of domestic and international concerns. His current portfolio focuses on programs at the Postal Service and the Department of Transportation. Mr. Robert Reisner is President and CEO of Transformation Strategies and has been a management consultant for more than 20 years, specializing in strategic market transformation. He has previously served in the executive positions at the Postal Service, including Vice President for Strategic Planning from 1996 to 2001. We'll now begin witness testimony. Mr. Bernstock, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Mr. Bernstock, could you pull that microphone a little closer to you? Thank you. Sir, I think that your folder is blocking the. If you can pull that forward a little bit.
All right, that should make a big difference. Should I begin again, or just whatever?
Take it from the top.
All right, here we go. See what happens with the microphone on. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. I appreciate your interest in the revenue generation activities of the Postal Service, as that is a primary focus of my work. I would like to begin by recognizing Congress's active support of the Postal Service this year, especially your understanding of the urgency behind changing the retiree health benefit payment structure for fiscal year 2009. The Postal Service continues to face severe financial challenges. Our auditors are currently reviewing our fiscal year 2009 financials, and while I cannot give you the precise figures, I can say that despite heroic cost reductions of over $6 billion, we expect our mail volume to decline by approximately 26 billion pieces, with a net loss of over $7 billion prior to accounting for recent legislation. There is no certainty that mail volume levels will recover, or if they will, continue to decline to be replaced with other forms of communication. But we are certain that without significant changes, the potential exists for similarly large financial losses in the foreseeable future. We are actively engaged in a four-pronged effort to correct Postal Service finances. The first and most obvious approach is to continue to aggressively bring down our costs. The Postal Service has set very aggressive cost reduction targets. A change in delivery frequency from 6 days to 5 days and modification of retiree health benefit fund payments are both integral elements of the second strategy. The third and fourth paths are the subject of today's hearings. to be equally aggressive in our efforts to grow revenue within the law and to change the law to provide greater product and pricing flexibility. An example of how we utilized our pricing freedoms enabled by the Postal Act is the Standard Mail Summer Sale. Working with the PRC, we developed the summer sale, offering a 30% price discount on incremental volume on advertising mail for 3 months over this summer. We are still evaluating this program, but preliminary information suggests that over 400 of our largest customers participated and mailed a significant number of incremental pieces of standard mail to help stimulate the economy. I would like to give special thanks to the PRC for its quick and thorough review of this proposal. The summer sale, along with other revenue-generating initiatives that I described in some detail in my written testimony, like the Priority Mail advertising campaign, Priority Mail contract pricing, and consumer products at retail, including greeting cards, are all underway, already taking advantage of the flexibility afforded by the Postal Act. Some have already generated incremental revenue, and others are just hitting the marketplace. There are additional initiatives described in my testimony that are still in the planning stages, designed to extend or transform the business by expanding the core capabilities into new business areas. 3 examples are: first, renewed approaches to the distribution of product samples; second, the extension of passport processing and enrollment services to secure credentials; and third, the exploration of hybrid mail that is either sent, delivered, or both in digital form. One of the purposes of today's hearings is to examine the constraints that hold the Postal Service back. I outlined specific requests for changes in the postal law in my written testimony, including the authority to provide services to state and local authorities in addition to federal agencies, to provide explicit authority for purely electronic equivalents of the traditional physical services, and to provide more freedoms to leverage our existing assets, especially our retail assets. While I'm excited about our revenue-generating projects and the potential for greater freedoms, I want to be clear that revenue alone is not sufficient to close the earnings gap. Even at a 15% pre-tax profit margin, it would take profit generated by almost $45 billion in new revenue to fill that earnings gap. The 4 prongs together are necessary to provide a framework for the Postal Service to be self-sustaining while fulfilling our universal service obligation at service levels the country has come to expect. We are very proud of our accomplishments in meeting the communication and commerce needs of the country, but we recognize that without the help of Congress, we cannot close our significant profitability gap and adequately meet our universal service obligation. I would like to thank this subcommittee for holding this hearing and to reaffirm my personal commitment to working with you to ensure a postal service that meets the mailing and shipping needs of the American public. I would be pleased to respond to any questions you may have.
Thank you. Ms. Galway, welcome. You are now recognized for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Lynch, Ranking Member Chavez, Congressman Davis, Connolly, and Cummins. I'm pleased to be here today. This subcommittee has a critical role to play in preserving a treasured American asset. The Postal Service is a government agency that connects together every American household, business, and institution through its universal service network. It is a part of our daily life, taken for granted until taken away, part of the fabric of the nation, supporting its educational, political, and charitable institutions. Congress has played an ongoing role in revitalizing the postal system, most recently through the PAEA. The law was designed to preserve the service's historic attributes while providing change for the 21st century. But it was enacted at a time when both the economy and the Postal Service appeared strong. Now the landscape has changed. I think the PAE is working, but it's hard to see how well given the recession. There have been clear successes. First, the Commission and the Postal Service have worked together to take advantage of competitive flexibilities in the law. Through our rate process, the Postal Service has used its pricing power to significantly increase the rate of return on its overall competitive product line. Mr. Bernstock provided the details. Second, this year the Commission approved the Postal Service's first ever request to test seasonal price incentive programs for standard and first-class mail, as well as the first and only experimental product submitted under the PAEA. Third, the Postal Service NSA proposals have accelerated under the new law, rising 900% in less than 3 years. Preliminary data on revenue generation activities indicate that overall results have been positive but modest. Since the majority of these efforts involve price discounts, they result in limited additional revenue and provide significantly less contribution to overhead. So while the Commission would like to see more progress being made, particularly in the experimental area, there has been a reasonable effort expended to use the new law. The truth is that the powerful downturn in the economy, which has caused a sharp contraction in key mailing industries like housing, finance, and automobiles, would have overwhelmed even the most ambitious of these efforts. There's a tremendous difference between a gradual annual decline of 1 or 2% in first-class mail, which was the trend addressed by the PAEA, and a 13% drop in volume experienced this year. As a result, the Postal Service could not make its payment to the Retiree Healthcare Benefit Fund, the RHBF, and received $4 billion of relief this year from Congress. And for the immediate future, and perhaps some time to come, this situation appears likely to continue. The Postal Service has suggested that it needs additional freedoms modeled on the examples of foreign posts. The Commission is open to considering new perspectives. However, we believe they need to reflect American experience and tradition. My written testimony includes several examples from foreign posts. There may be some activities that fit the American model, but there is no magic bullet. Any new business activity should meet a set of reasonable but specific criteria based on the core mission of the Postal Service, the needs of society, and the expectation of a positive outcome for both. The rationales that others are doing it does not satisfy the criteria. Honestly, the Postal Service has directed most of its management resources toward reducing its costs this year by more than $6 billion. Cuts continue, from adjusting mail routes and renegotiating purchase agreements to removing collection boxes, consolidating plants, and closing post offices. Now the Postmaster General is asked to lift the statutory language requiring 6-day delivery. The Commission views proposals to reduce service with caution. Service cuts made to address near-term financial difficulties may have harmful long-term consequences for universal service. And from a market perspective, the Postal Service could harm its greatest strategic advantage, its ubiquity. I suggest a better alternative. The Congress may wish to amend the provisions of the PAA that set the RHBF's payments. The annual average payment of $5.5 billion is an enormous burden. The Commission's study of alternate RHBF values found that significantly lower payments by the Postal Service could still meet the original funding objectives of the law. Recalculation would be timely, as it would capture the Postal Service's sizable workforce reductions. Further, it would provide breathing room, resources for new initiatives, and some capital investment to enable better long-term planning for the service's future. Looking forward, the Postal Service currently provides a number of non-postal services that could generate new revenue. For example, the Postal Service now processes passports for the State Department. Other federal and state agencies that issue licenses and permits or have retail initiatives could partner with the service as well. The America the Beautiful Access Passes sold by the National Park Service is a partnership I've been advocating in particular. Considering our nation's energy efficient priorities, the Postal Service has the nation's largest civilian vehicle fleet, which could provide the critical mass needed to develop the transformational technologies and infrastructure to meet our national energy goals. Research indicates that postal delivery routes are especially well suited to electric vehicles. A national investment in a new fleet for the Postal Service would speed transformation, add green jobs, and reduce the Postal Service's operational overhead for the foreseeable future. Those of us in the mailing community have confidence in the value of the mail, and it's important to our economy and society. We believe that mail, letter carriers, and post offices serve a vital role in our community. How well the mail comes back, however, may well depend on how deeply service is cut now. That concludes my statement, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you. Mr. Coughlin, welcome. You're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and members of the subcommittee. The chairman did earlier just introduce me. I am Michael Coughlin. I want to make clear I am here not representing any particular organization or group, but I have spent over 40 years in the postal industry. I did spend 32 years with USPS, and for the last 10 years I've been working in a consulting role, primarily focused on foreign posts. I've been asked here today to share my perspective on the revenue generation efforts of foreign posts and the lessons we might take from those here in the U.S. My written statement touches on the range of initiatives undertaken by foreign posts and summarizes the varying levels of success that some of them have had. I'm not going to rehash those here, But let me get right to what I think are the common success factors that some of these posts have had in raising alternative revenues and some of the lessons we might glean from them. When I look at something like 15 different postal organizations around the world and their revenue generation efforts, I see four kind of common management characteristics among the more successful of those, at least in their revenue-raising efforts. Those four characteristics include real clarity around strategic direction and a narrow focus on the markets and segments that they want to target. They know what they want to do, and they do it. There's a strong innovation agenda in these organizations and a forward-looking culture that embraces change. In those organizations, innovation is an expectation. These posts generally have the ability to recruit top talent. Many of the key players, particularly on the revenue generation side, come from outside the traditional postal experience. And one other common factor among them is they tend to focus, when they undertake these initiatives, on the customer experience and making that as positive as possible. Whatever the successful posts set out to do, they strive to do it better than the competition. Now, these are the four kind of common characteristics, and these are largely created by the management themselves. And for the most part, there are some exceptions, but for the most part, I think these are generally within the current capability of USPS. But every bit as important to their success is the set of conditions that the governments of these posts have put in place as they've looked at their posts and their futures. There are three critically important conditions that they tend to have in common. The legal framework within which they operate provides complete commercial freedom of action to operate in a competitive market. They operate very much like private entities do in their country and in this country as well. The regulator in these countries usually has a light and a supporting hand, and their primary focus is generally on universal service issues, the reserved areas, and the generation of competition in their local postal markets. Third, there is little political interference in the basic business decisions that these posts make, provided the post operates within the legal framework they've been given. In my judgment, these are the fundamental success factors for those posts in virtually all aspects of their operations. And of course, they generally have very solid leadership and a very effective governance structure at those posts. So what does this mean for USPS? Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, I think there are two other important factors to keep in mind in a discussion of revenue initiatives and the authority and the flexibility of that USPS has under the law. The first of these issues is scale. I do not want to discourage anyone, but the problem USPS faces today is measured in billions of dollars. Finding new sources of revenue for USPS is important, but think about it. 1,000 projects worth $1 million each will generate $1 billion. Or make it 10 projects worth $100 million. And that may not be enough. While the recent reform law provided some additional flexibility to the Postal Service, I frankly have not heard of any initiatives approaching anything like that. And I don't say that to denigrate in any way what the Postal Service and its colleagues have tried to do. But to have a real impact in this area, it's going to take some different and some very big thinking. The second issue is every bit as challenging. Unlike most of the posts I have discussed today here, in the U.S. there is a very strong philosophical aversion to a government entity competing in private markets with goods and services that are already available from private sources. In the past, when USPS has attempted to offer such services, there's been very strong and noisy resistance, and eventually USPS hears from some of you. I have personally experienced that. I do not see that situation changing, simply because the postal revenue problem is bigger today. Now, given this latter challenge, whatever revenue initiatives the USPS undertakes outside the traditional postal arena will probably have to involve partnerships and alliances with private entities, where both parties can leverage the strengths of the other. In the case of USPS, it has enormous geographic reach in its retail network, and they touch virtually every home in the country through their delivery network. Some of the opportunities might include expanded financial services availability, expanded delivery options, government and agency services, or a link between the physical presence of the USPS and emerging communications technologies and services. After hearing the Postmaster General's October 8th speech at the National Press Club, I could imagine that some of the bankers in this country were bristling when the Postmaster General answered a hypothetical question at his National Press Club speech about what new business he'd like to be in by saying that he'd like to be a bank. Well, instead of immediately thinking defensively...
Mr. Coughlin, you need to wrap up. We're way over on your time. Thank you.
Instead of thinking defensively, perhaps the bankers ought to put their innovation hats on and try to imagine how they could capitalize on what USPS has to offer. The same goes for other organizations looking for really new ways of engaging their customers. So what have we learned from foreign posts? Frankly, I think we've learned that what they're doing is interesting, but it's not terribly applicable to the USPS. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Hare, welcome back.
Right.
You're now recognized for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Chairman Lynch, Ranking Member Chaffetz, and members of the subcommittee. I'm pleased to appear again before this subcommittee today to discuss the Postal Service's revenue generation initiatives. First, I'll provide an update on the Postal Service's financial condition. Second, discuss revenue-related changes made by the Postal Accountability and Enhancement Act of 2006, or PIAA. Third, outline actions the Postal Service has taken to increase revenue since 2006. And fourth, discuss issues related to generating new postal revenues. Turning first to the Postal Service's preliminary financial results in fiscal year 2009 and going forward. Mail volume declined about 28 billion pieces, and revenue declined from about $75 billion to $68 billion. Congressional action was required to reduce the Postal Service's mandated retiree health payment by $4 billion. Outstanding debt increased by $3 billion to $10.2 billion. At this pace, the Postal Service will reach its $15 billion statutory debt limit in fiscal year 2011. Further, deficits over $7 billion are predicted in fiscal years 2010 and 2011. With regard to revenue generation and key postal products, PIAA gave the service greater pricing flexibility, including for market-dominant products that generate 88% of its revenues. Market-dominant mail is generally subject to an inflationary price cap. Competitive products are not subject to a price cap, but each competitive product must cover its costs. PIAA prohibited the Postal Service from offering new non-postal products and services. Turning to actions that the Postal Service has taken since PIAA was enacted. The service increased average rates for market-dominant mail in 2008 and 2009 at virtually the maximum allowable under the price cap. This year, 3 targeted rate incentives were provided to stimulate mail volume. A summer sale was introduced for standard mail, and there is an ongoing fall sale for first-class mail and an incentive program for saturation mail. For competitive products, there are annual rate increases for priority and express mail in 2008 and 2009, and the service introduced volume discounts for these types of mail as well as a priority flat rate box. The Postal Service has entered into about 90 contracts with large mailers for other competitive products that are generally volume-based with provisions intended to lower its costs. With regard to generating increased revenues, the Postal Service has asked Congress to change the PIAA restriction on offering new postal products so that it could move into areas such as banking, insurance, and non-postal retail services. We previously analyzed past Postal Service forays in the non-postal area, reporting that it lost nearly $85 million in the mid-90s on 19 new products, including electronic commerce services and a remittance processing business. In 2001, we reported that none of its electronic commerce initiatives were profitable and the management of these efforts was fragmented. The Postal Service's interest in moving into new business lines raises several fundamental questions. Should the Postal Service compete in areas where there are already private sector providers? Should antitrust and consumer protection laws apply equally to the Postal Service and its competitors? If the Postal Service were to compete in banking, insurance, and retail services, should it be subject to the same regulatory entities as its competitors? If the Postal Service used its 37,000 retail facilities to offer new non-postal services, would this provide an unfair competitive advantage? And how would non-postal activities be financed given the service's current debt levels? Would it be allowed to borrow at Treasury rates? In conclusion, we added the Postal Service to our high-risk list this past July, noting that it urgently needs to restructure to remain financially viable. Although it has used its pricing and product flexibility, results to date have been limited, in part linked to the economy. At this point, the Postal Service has no business plan that clearly details its proposals for entering new non-postal markets and what specific legislative changes would be needed. Generating new revenues from postal products and services appears more promising than venturing into potentially risky non-postal areas. At the same time, much work remains to reduce postal operational costs. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my statement, and I'm pleased to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Reasonable, welcome. You're now recognized for 5 minutes. Could we ask you to put your microphone on and just pull a little bit?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Chaffetz,
Pull a
and
little,
members
up
of
a
the
little bit. Perfect. Thank you.
How's that? In my statement, I explain why I believe the Postal Service and the mailing community can become a source of innovation and new postal revenue through public-private partnerships that were encouraged by Congress in Section 1004 of the Postal Accountability and Enhancement Act. Today, there's a broad consensus that bold action must be taken to reinvigorate the postal system, and fortunately, there are some real and tangible opportunities to create new value for postal customers. To be clear, let me offer a few examples that might be called enabling the last mile, extending democracy's reach, and promoting green routes. By enabling the last mile, I refer to the many opportunities that exist for putting technology in the hands of the letter carrier. In other words, on the doorstep of the postal consumer. One of the areas of greatest interest to mailers has been wanting to know where their mail is while it's en route to its destination. The USPS was seen as a black hole compared with FedEx and UPS, who've invested billions to enable their higher-end services to track and trace mail products. This is going to change imminently because the Postal Service is on the verge of creating a smart grid of intelligent mail services. Now we can go beyond the barcode and offer tracking technologies that have exciting possibilities for adding new value for customers. What's more, we can download applications to the scanner technology that's finally, within the last 6 months, in the hands of the letter carriers. Customers can realize new, tangible benefits and new postal revenue can be created. But to make this happen, we need to collectively create an innovative enterprise of tests and trials and partnerships. A second broad theme that Chairman Ruth Goldway in particular has championed has been vote by mail. The Postal Service can do this and can provide many other government services as well. To be practical and secure, it will require connecting hard copy services to Internet services, and that will necessitate partnerships. But the opportunity to expand the capacity of the Postal Service to continue to serve as democracy's agent is here. And third, there are opportunities for the Postal Service to again serve the nation by carrying parcels that today cause 3 and 4 trucks to travel the same route. We can reduce carbon emissions by creating green postal routes. This will take some re-engineering and perhaps some recognition under cap and trade, but there are new opportunities here if we seize them. In conclusion, I didn't invent these ideas. They came from the community, from the mailing community, from letter carriers who have said, why not? They come from creative mailers who've said, why can't we have a smart envelope? And from suppliers who've shown how to do it. To tap this creativity, mindsets that were established when the Internet was still a future vision have to be changed. to homegrown governmental internet services, it's time to say, that was then, this is now. In the future, innovation is going to come through collaboration and partnership, where the Postal Service does what it does best, and where the private sector, through partnerships, provides internet services and makes mail relevant to the consumer of the future. If we make the modern postal services relevant by connecting them to this multi-channel internet marketplace, they'll generate more mail. This is the real revenue opportunity entailed in what we're talking about here today. The coming years could be an exciting time of transformation, or they could be a train wreck. The difference will be whether there is clear public policy guidance that can define the difference between the creative balance of what should be public and postal and what the private sector can do best. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to answering any questions.
Thank you. I yield myself 5 minutes for questions. Mr. Bernstock, I do appreciate your honesty in your statement that we're not going to solve this on the revenue side alone. I think that's apparent just by the numbers. In 2008, we saw mail volume go down 9.5 billion pieces. And then in the fiscal year ending October 1, 2009, we saw it drop 26 billion. There's no way in the near term that we could turn the system around and solve that problem by selling more greeting cards or any other service that we might be capable of doing right now. And at the same time, we're a little bit disappointed up here with the consolidation effort and the cost-saving side. It does not appear that the original target of closing maybe 1,400 facilities is anywhere near probable. I think the Post Office has reduced its consolidation numbers to below 400 now, and it won't nearly capture the savings that we thought were possible. As well, the early retirement incentives that, well, not great incentives, but the programs themselves have not gleaned the type of utilization on the part of the employees. So we still have a lot of people that are resisting an early buyout. We still have a large workforce. Understandably so. Those workers, their 401ks are cut in half, most of them, so they don't want to retire in an environment like this. Yet we face a situation where we need transformational leadership. We need a truly dynamic change at the Post Office, the way we do business. And there's a saying that says that there's nothing more disruptive to the human condition than the pain of a new idea. And unfortunately, that's what we're facing. And look, I love my postal workers, and I'll be the first one to admit it. And I don't want to see layoffs. I don't want to see any of that. So I'm trying all these other measures to protect the employees because, quite frankly, when we grade the consumer satisfaction, the customer satisfaction among the federal agencies, the Post Office, because of the work of their clerks, because of the work of their mail handlers, because of the work of their letter carriers that go to every home and business in America 6 days a week, by far, they are the highest rated federal agency that we have in America today. They do the best job. So I think it would be a mistargeting of our problems to look at the backs of our employees to try to solve this problem. So we need to change our structure. And I was wondering, there have been a few things mentioned here today about allowing the Post Office through the Postal Accountability and Enhancement Act to branch out into these other areas. And I know that there's some apprehension in competing with the private sector. But there's some areas, specifically my colleague, Mr. Chaffetz, came up with an idea about the Postal Service taking over major responsibilities from the census. Now, the Post Office already through the mail handlers and the letter carriers. They go into every home and business in America already. And that's basically what the census does. It tracks the population most effectively through those home visits. Have you looked at any of that? So it would be government taking over government work, but just doing it more efficiently for the taxpayer. Have we looked at any of that, or have we looked at, Ms. Golway has mentioned the vote by mail. Have we looked at any of those? I know they're disruptive. I know bureaucracies are not going to be satisfied with that, but I think we have very limited choices. Have you looked at any of those type of initiatives that might really transform what we're doing at the post office? Could you?
I will master this eventually.
All right.
Chairman, we've looked at everything you've said. We've looked at the fact that we have $6 billion in cost savings that came in this year, and we're looking to lose $7 billion. We're looking at the fact that mail has declined. And we're looking at both huge transformational revenue issues. As I said, $45 billion is what it would take to close the gap. We have some initiatives underway, and we've also looked very specifically at the initiatives you've identified. On the census piece, my understanding is through the mail, 80 or 90% of census responses come in, and while it's not within my area of responsibility, I do understand that there was a report by our operations team meeting with the Census Bureau which said that for going back and knocking on doors 6 or 7 or 8 times to get that last 5%, we may not be the best suited agency, but we are willing to relook at that. Vote by mail, we are very actively looking at a range of ways we can do that and have a series of initiatives underway.
Okay, I have exhausted my time, so I'm going to yield to the ranking member for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Herr, has there been any sort of analysis, or any of you actually could answer this? Is there, the one area we can point to where there's some cross functionality within the government is the passports. Is that a revenue generator? Is it just a break-even type of operation? Has there been any sort of analysis that says, boy, that was a good idea?
We have not done that analysis. Mr. Bernstock perhaps may have.
Ms. Goldwyn?
Ms. Goldwyn.
The Commission has done the analysis, and it is it provides, it not only breaks even, but it provides a contribution to overhead. So in fact, it would make a profit for the Postal Service. It is a successful revenue generation tool.
All right, so I want to hear some ideas here. So I like the one about that you mentioned about the national park passes and that sort of thing. That's not going to get us out of the financial hole that we're in. But what are the big ideas that are floating out there? And I just want to express again the sincere reluctance to get into areas where the private sector is already competing. The financial services, the telecom stuff, I can't imagine being supportive of that. I'm just being as candid as I can, because there you have those services in the marketplace. But if we look at state and local government, if we look at federal government, if we look at our constitutional duties, roles, and responsibilities, it seems to me there are a number of agencies that would benefit by the sheer structure and magnitude of the workforce above and beyond what we've creatively thought up today.
Congressman, I agree with that statement. And we do have the authority to provide credentialing and enrollment services to federal agencies. If we extended that authority to state and local agencies, I think we could do even more. And
how many are you doing at the federal level? Give me a better sense of.
Well, the passport, the enrollment process on the passport is one active business we're engaged in. We feel that we could partner with a whole range of federal agencies, be it TSA or Social Security or agriculture. There's a number of ways we can do credentialing and enrollment work.
Is there like a list of these out there? Are we pursuing
we're
these
actively
types of things?
engaged with several federal
Can you give me some more specifics about which ones you're pursuing or which ones
I don't have that data with me, but I can get it for you for the record.
I'm sorry, did you want to add something to that, Ms. Gold?
I'm very gratified that the Postal Service is now beginning to look at this area, because it is potentially a great resource and a great source of stability for the local post offices in the community. One of the issues that came up in a hearing we had recently is that While the post office itself may not generate a lot of revenue, having a post office in a local community shopping center creates revenue and economic development activity for the rest of the community around it. So it's important, I think, for the for the well-being of the economy overall to continue to support post
I agree.
offices.
We're just
And-
looking
and
for
these-
real specifics
these
here.
abilities to connect with local government will provide at least enough revenue to continue to justify the service, if not solve the entire problem.
Mr. Reesner, if you had to come up with a list of the best 3-4 ideas that you've seen or heard out there, what would be on that list? Specific.
Well, the biggest thing of all, and I think that Mr. Bernstock just talked for a minute ago about the credentialing services. The idea that government-to-government services are something that the Postal Service can do and is encouraged to do under the law offers a platform for coming up with other creative ideas. I think the most important thing is that the marketplace bring the Postal Service the ideas, but that the Postal Service has, as Mr. Coughlin just talked about, become an innovative place where people have the sense that they can come and plug and play and try ideas and test their ideas in the marketplace to the benefit of postal customers.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I would definitely echo that. I would like to put out a call to the private sector to say, please come to our rescue here. We need the creative innovation that's going to come from the populace across this country with the creative, innovative ideas that are going to be those big ideas that the Postal Service can participate in, at the same time making sure we don't overly step into the private sector where rightfully the private sector should be leading the charge. But there are credentialing services, and we need to continue to explore those ideas. I tend to think that the private sector is going to help come up with those ideas bigger and broader. So please, if you have those ideas, send them to us. We need them. And I see I'm out of time. I'm getting ready to. I'm going to be under time this time, Mr. Chairman. I'd just like to note that. Oh, shoot, I blew it. All right, bye.
Well done. Okay. Mr. Davis is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. You know, I try to be as optimistic as possible. And as I listened to the witnesses, I thought of the baseball game that I was watching last night, especially when the score got to be 7-1. And I was wondering if there was any way that Philadelphia was going to get back. And I thought, you know, if you bunt, get a guy on first base, you bunt again, get another one on second base. That is, you come up with a number of different ideas, but they all kind of small in terms of generating the big runs that you really needed. And so when I think of changing prices for shipping services, bring down the cost, reorganize sales, become more competitive, I guess I'm thinking reorganize sales to sell what? You know, other than stamps and shipping. Or if you've got some of the other services, is there any way that you can really be competitive or as competitive as you need to be? And so, Ms. Goldway, I'm thinking that eventually you get down to this last resort business. And I wanted to ask, what would you consider to be last resort in terms of being forced to cut services? When would last resort come?
If you're the commission has a process for making these decisions, and it involves hearing from the public and getting a whole range of information about costs and benefits before we would make such a decision. Certainly the Postal Service has brought forward to us an end case where we are looking at the possibility of closing some post offices. And they've suggested that they may bring another case about reducing service from 6 to 5 day delivery. There is not agreement yet on what the cost savings would be to close post offices. And there is certainly no agreement yet on what the cost savings would be to reduce service from 6 to 5 days. And the trade-off between reducing service and reduction in potential volume is something that needs to be looked at. If you cut service, do you reduce demand more than you would if you maintain service? I think it's a very complicated matter. And what I think our Commission's responsibility to do is to focus on what the PAA tells us, which is to assure an efficient and effective postal service that provides universal service. So we would have to look at those trade-offs. I may be more of an optimist than you. I'm a Brooklyn Dodger fan, you know, and I've survived. I think that incremental support can make a difference, and that there are many surprising things that develop in the Postal Service. Netflix, for instance, is one that, at least for a time, is bringing us in a significant amount of revenue. And there may be others that develop as well. I certainly hope so.
Well, thank you very much. And, you know, I appreciate the efforts and the creative thinking that the Postal Service has put forth. I just don't want Casey at the bat. Mr. Coughlin, let me ask you, because I listened closely to your testimony. What, or do you have a prognosis under which we can really pull this out and pull it off?
Well, that's the $68 billion question, I think. Let me just say I'm not quite perhaps as big an optimist as Chairman Goldway about the future of mail volume. I do think it is going to continue to slide. I think the short-term, relatively short-term options the Postal Service has on the cost side are fairly evident. They've pretty much been talked about. I think they need to reduce the number of delivery days. I think we're one of the few countries in the world that still has 6-day delivery. I think they need to reduce the size of their processing network from around 300 processing facilities to perhaps half of that size. And I think they need to reduce the size of their retail network. Those are, I think, some obvious moves, and I know that they're difficult. They're not changes that are going to go down easily, and they have some costs associated with them as well as some savings. I think the Postal Service itself needs to think in terms of what would a 400,000 person Postal Service look like, and how would you operate and still deliver on the universal service obligation, because I think that's, in my judgment, that's probably where it's going to go. You need to continue to work on the revenue issues that have been discussed. The ranking member, Mr. Chaffetz, talked about the ideas that are generated from here. What I would really encourage, I'd encourage on the one hand the Postal Service to get out there and sell the obvious benefits of the Postal Service in terms of its ubiquity and its geographic reach to potential partners out there. But I would also, I mean, I see new bank branches going up constantly in growing neighborhoods out there, new brick and mortar. And I'd have to ask myself as a banker, is there a possibility to partner with an organization like the Postal Service to provide financial services, agency services, all kinds of opportunities are out there. It gets complicated, I think, partly by the way that the federal government is organized and the way its funding processes work in terms of the subparts of agencies. So that makes it complicated to kind of get an overall view of how an agency delivers services and how it might tap into the Postal Service. But there are a lot of opportunities out there. I hope I'm wrong, but I think that's the direction it's going.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Kucinich, for 5 minutes, who yields to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Conley, for 5 minutes.
I thank my colleagues. You know, listening to all of the hearings we've had on this subject, we we are clearly in search, as we move forward in this century, for a new, viable business model for the U.S. Postal Service. And on the one hand, I think we in Congress maybe want to have it both ways. On the one hand, we recognize the iconic value of the post office in a given community, its centrality in especially smaller rural parts of our country, and we don't want that to change. We don't want you closing offices. We don't want you changing routes. We don't want you cutting back on service or the numbers of days of service. And on the other, and oh, by the way, we don't want you unnecessarily competing with the private sector for anything. On the other hand, why aren't you viable? Why are you losing money? Why aren't you making money? Why aren't you like your competitors? And we in Congress can't have it both ways. We're going to have to work with you to recognize that by statute, and Mr. Hare, I'd be interested in listening to your testimony. I think one of the things we have to talk about, should the post office be subject to the same regulations as the private sector? Well, but by statute, we put some requirements on the Postal Service, don't we, that we don't put in the private sector, that I think significantly circumscribes the ability of the post office to sort of break out here and just be a rational actor in the private market.
I'd agree with that. I think part of it is we're just simply trying to pose some questions that folks in your situation should be considering as you take a look at this. It's a large enterprise. It touches everyone's life 6 days a week. I mean, as Chairman Lynch mentioned at the opening, no other institution does that 6 days a week. And as you proceed with thinking about this, some of those trade-offs, those get raised, and I think it's important to keep them on the table as folks consider them, because if we don't raise them now, they'll come up later.
Yeah. Okay, I would just add to your list, though, I think you have an obligation, GAO, to look at the statutory limitations or expectations we put on the Postal Service that make it different than an entity in the private sector.
Well, and on that point, we have ongoing work looking at the Postal Service business model, and as part of that, we're factoring those kind of things into it as well. So thank you.
Okay. Mr. Reisner, how could the Postal Service incorporate, let's say, this banking, the banking idea that Ms. Goldway talked about without threatening community banks?
Well, I think that Mr. Coughlin just really talked about it a second ago, that I think that there has to be a process that creates some kind of partnership in which the private sector gets to do what it does best. This is the marketplace that we live in today. I just one quick point that I'd make, too, that I think Jack Potter the other day in his speech at the National Press Club created this framework and embraced something that Ruth Goldway had endorsed, which was looking out to the future, 10 years, and trying to imagine what kind of a postal service should we have to serve the public purposes that we see 10 years from now. And I can't look out 10 years and not imagine that the Internet isn't a part of the marketplace at that time. Now, is it appropriate for the Postal Service to provide those services? Probably not. And so finding partnerships where the public sector can be compensated for its retail presence and its ubiquity, and the private sector can provide what it provides best, it seems to me is part of that 10-year vision.
What, Ms. Goldway, what do we know about, and anyone else, but what do we know about the elasticity of demand for the price of stamps? I mean, is the demand inelastic such that we can raise the price to whatever we need to raise, or do we see significant fall off in volume every time we in fact raise the price?
Well, we have about 40 years of following the prices.
I'm sorry, I cannot hear you.
Oh, we have about 40, in the Commission, we have about 40 years of following what we call the elasticity of price of first-class mail. And for pretty much all that time, we could say it was inelastic. You raise the price and sales might drop off a little, but they'd come back up. And that stamp usage followed the rate of population growth and to some degree the economy all through that time. But things really seem to have changed in the last 4 or 5 years. And there was a slow but steady decrease in the first-class mail. and it has been greatly increased by this recession. And the dilemma for all of us is to see whether the recession was an unusual event, because there was a great drop-off in mail after 9/11, but it picked right back up again, or is this a lasting phenomenon? I think all of us feel that the growth of the Internet makes the role of mail very different from what it may have been in the past, and that we're all trying to find ways to make the mail relevant and valuable. So it may not be that we sell as many stamps, but what we sell is more valuable. People are willing to pay more for it, or there is some other way in which the community supports it. Some of the European posts have subsidies for their mail, or specific subsidies for post offices. And in fact, even those that have had great profits in the last few years are having real problems under this recession as well. So just assuming that you can follow a European model where there's privatization will get you some ongoing, permanent, independent post office is not assured either.
Mr. Chairman, my time has expired, and I thank you. I do think Ms. Goldway's answer underscores, and I thank you for it, underscores the fact that moving forward, we can't just tinker at the edges. We've got to figure out a new business model that's going to work. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Kucinich, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I'm grateful that under your leadership this committee continues to look at what we can do to secure universal service to the people of the United States. In my neighborhood in Cleveland, Ohio, I have seen over the last few years the post boxes disappear from neighborhoods. And I don't take that lightly, because to me that has been an essential part of the infrastructure of postal service. Now the next part of the infrastructure of postal service are the branches. And of course we know that that the Postal Administration has been systematically targeting branches, particularly in areas which are economically disadvantaged. Think about universal service. And we know they're cutting hours, keep trying to downsize this postal service. Now, at the same time, there's been an expansion of dealings with the private sector. The private sector take over more and more. Now, I think we need to look long and hard about this creeping privatization that's been going on in the Postal Service, because it's really at odds with universal service. It's if the Postal Service is a money loser, why does the private sector want to take it over? Think about that. If it loses money, why would anyone want to take it over or even turn it into a bank if it's such a money loser? This service belongs to the people of the United States. Now, I have, and while certainly every business model needs to be updated, privatization is not updating the business model of the Postal Service, it's destroying the Postal Service. I have a question for Chairman Goldway. Welcome to this committee, Chairman. Your testimony echoes my concern that in diversifying the services the United States Postal Service provides, plans to move forward with providing non-postal related services could lead to a reduction in essential services traditionally provided by the Post Office and could subordinate the provision of these services to the pursuit of revenue. Much of the United States Postal Service airmail has already been outsourced to FedEx. Can you please explain, and can you expand on the Postal Regulatory Commission's concerns regarding cuts in essential services until revenue generation plans have been successfully implemented? And is the Commission concerned that moving away from traditional services could lead to the privatization of the core services the Post Office is mandated to provide? If you could respond.
Thank you, Congressman Kucinich. both of us met each other 30 some odd years ago when we were
If you
mayors
could
of
speak,
our cities.
I'm sorry, Madam Chair. if
Both
you
of
could
us
speak closer.
first met each other when we were mayors of our respective cities about 30 years ago. So we share this focus on the local impact of the Postal Service, I think. I don't think the Commission is opposed to the Postal Service providing non-postal services, our litmus test is that we expect the services to be in support of the mail function. So greeting cards are fine. Money orders that the Postal Service has provided, and even electronic money orders internationally, are fine. Copying services are fine. There's a range of services that are fine. And we are certainly open to the Postal Service coming up with any number of experimental products, should they have them, that are related to postal services that we could define as postal service. So we actively support and look forward to the Postal Service coming forward with those new ideas, and I think our record is that we accept almost all of them. The problem is, if you look at the Postal Service and its network, the retail clerks that are there are paid very high wages, and I think they should be. But look at the bank next door and the wages that are paid to the bank next door. It's not likely that a bank is going to want to partner with the Postal Service unless there's some real change in wage structure, which may result in problems as well. So all of these proposals
if I may,
have
my
problems.
time is expiring, and I would just like to make this observation. Mr. Chairman, concluding. If banks want to partner with post offices, the only reason they'd want to do that is so they could take over the post offices, so that people would then have to do their postal business through banking. I mean, this is very easy to see. These things go either way. You can't, we used to be able to go to banks and pay bills. Then they stopped doing that, okay? It's easy for them to take up the function of mailing and then just take it over from the government. We already had enough experience with the workings of banks here to know that if banks, we're looking to the private sector to provide solutions for government services, we're probably looking in the wrong place.
I thank the gentleman. Just briefly, I'm going to yield myself 15 seconds. I think what's happening here, though, is that now we see a model out there, a competitive model. When I go to the Stop and Shop, or you go to the Piggly Wiggly to do your shopping, there's a bank there. There's all kinds of different things offered. So I think the Postal Service is under that similar pressure as well. But I'll wait till I have 5 minutes to expound on that a little further. But I deeply appreciate the gentleman's comments, and I agree with the threat that he's identified. At this point, I'd like to also welcome former Representative William Clay. Thank you very much, sir. We appreciate your attendance just in time to hear from your son, the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Clay, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for conducting this hearing today. Like all of us, I am deeply invested in the success of the Postal Service, and I'm happy we have continued to think critically about ensuring a positive future for the USPS. Also, let me welcome my panel to these proceedings, and I thank you for being here to share your expertise. Also, as the chairman mentioned, my older brother is in the front row too, so we welcome him also. Let me start off by saying much of your recent effort has gone towards innovation in new markets. Is there any value in expanding existing postal services to increase revenue and customer loyalty? And anybody can take a shot at it. Ms. Galway?
Sure. I think, Congressman Clay, there's a balance between driving down costs and growing revenue. And I think the tension starts with the fact that, once again, this year we had $6 billion in cost savings. And we did a little bit of research. We think that's the single largest cost savings by any company in this country, possibly ever. Yet we lost $7 billion. So on all the revenue-generating initiatives that we're pursuing within the law clearly contribute. But when you have a loss of that magnitude, you can't get back to a stable post office or postal service without some changes in the cost savings initiatives that are not within the law at the current time.
How about, has there been any effort to strengthen these services such as first-class mail?
At the current time, we're running a fall first-class incentive program, and the impact of that we estimate will be $50 million, $100 million in incremental revenue in that ballpark. But once again, in comparison to a $7 billion loss, it's relatively modest in the impact. So there are things we're doing. Elasticity, as Chairman Goldway pointed out, is increasing, both from consumers and commercial mailers, and so we're fighting a very, very difficult uphill battle.
Well, I guess that begs the question then, how can the USPS carve out their own niche in the postal market and continue to differentiate itself from other mail services?
Well, as many of the panelists have said, and as we've heard, we have an enormous number of strengths. Be it our infrastructure, our retail infrastructure, our delivery capabilities, our logistics capability, the fact that we're number one in trust, all of the strengths that we have should be leveraged. What we need to do is have more freedom to expand our model as this country changes and build on the strengths that we have.
You know, you cite examples in international markets as evidence that USPS should include other services for customers. How successful have these efforts been internationally? Do they turn a profit or do they break even? I think perhaps Mr. Coughlin can answer.
Well, I will comment on. I do list in my written statement some of the results they've had. Some of these posts have generated as much as 75% of their total revenues from non-postal sources. Deutsche Post, for example, in Germany is an example. The Dutch Postal Service, TNT, is generating 60%. But they have undertaken major diversification. The Germans, for example, have bought heavily into the logistics business. They've made several multi-billion euro acquisitions to get into that business. They've had, to be perfectly honest, although they show profits for the most part, they have, as Chairman Goldway said, they're having a little trouble right now with the fall in mail. And the interesting thing about the Germans is they're getting 75% of their revenues from non-postal sources, but they're getting 50% or more of their profits from mail. So mail's still a pretty good business for those people. So to call them a success, yeah, there are some success stories, but some are not doing quite as well as they look like they are on the surface.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back. I
thank the gentleman. One of the things that I worry about, I yield myself 5 minutes. One of the things that I worry about is that, that old adage that just like our military, we tend to fight the last war. And now the things that we're looking at, as Mr. Connolly has described as being nibbling around the edges, I look out there and you look at some of these other countries, as Mr. Coughlin has noted. Sweden has a system where you actually click on and you can see your mail, and you can click on, you can actually read some of it, the pamphlets or brochures or whatever that come to your house. You can click on whether you want to have it delivered or not, and that's a great environmental benefit, I think, in the long run, but it's going to drop the volume of mail. But I think that's really the future, and so I don't want to get caught up in addressing the things that we see now, but I'd rather us try to anticipate as a commercial business would what's coming down the line. I also see some of even our domestic models like Earth Class Mail and Zoombox, where it's a similar internet-based or internet-centered system. And I just think we have to really think long term here. There's a book out. It's an older book, The World is Flat by Tom Friedman, and he has one chapter there on UPS. I know my friends from UPS are in the back there, but he gave the example of Toshiba computer company. They had a warranty on their laptop computers, whereas if anything happened, you just mail it back to Japan, and they would fix it and send it back to you within a certain amount of days. And well, UPS, as it describes in this story, turned that all around to the fact where instead of the user just sending their laptop to Atlanta and then off to Japan to be fixed, UPS put their own people to work repairing those computers. And that is totally outside of the delivery business. They now became computer fixers, and they would save the Toshiba company a ton of money and make their customers happier. So, you know, it's that type of innovation and, you know, just transformative change that we need in the Postal Service. And I know it's frightening, and I know that bureaucracies are even more resistant to change, but I just see with the drop-off in volume, what we see coming down the line, I see the number of retirees we have in our postal system. We have to have a business model that allows us to continue to provide those benefits to retirees. So we're going to fall off a cliff here if we don't get our business model matched up with the realities that we have here. So we really, I know there may be some short-term disruption here, but you know, we just encourage you to take that chance to think big. Think big. This is a big problem. So the you know, the response here has to be, as I say, transformative. We have to look at this in a different way than just, you know, nibbling around the edges and trying to bring in a few more million in revenues. So again, you know, do you have anything like that you know, some big moves that would help us take a bite out of the deficit that we see?
Chairman Lynch, I speak for the Postal Service, and we fully agree with what you're saying. We are 5% of the world's population and 40% of the world's mail. We have been the world's innovator in hard copy mail, and what's frustrating is we believe we have the same kind of role to play within digital communications. It's hard for us to look at Sweden leading the U.S. We believe we should be out in front of the technology changes that are occurring, not for any other reason than to foster commerce and to be a market maker and to have the result be that the United States is a leader in this transformation to digital products and that we offer hybrid products. So I think without these kinds of transformational moves in concert with, you know, the cost savings we've talked about, we can have a thriving, growing Postal Service.
I'd just like to add that the Postal Service has presented hybrid mail products to us in the past, and we've approved them. Mailing online and Post ECS were both approved by the Postal Regulatory Commission, Postal Rate Commission at the time. It was the Postal Service that found that they could not implement those programs. They weren't up to the task. Now, if there's some partnership that they can develop, I think the Postal Regulatory Commission would certainly review that. I'm not sure that there's any need for new legislation. We'd be interested in looking at those issues.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of it this way. You know, you see what Walmart and these, you know, Stop and Shop and Piggly Wiggly and Harris Teeter, you know, these big box stores have done is they didn't try to recreate their own bank. They didn't try to recreate their own mail facility. They brought the post office in. They brought the banks in. They've used when you think about our scale, as Mr. Coughlin has outlined, that's also an advantage if we use it the right way, use that as leverage. And we have 37,000 post offices out there. And so we own the footprint. And what we put in there, and it may be, I'm not suggesting go out there and start the U.S. Postal Bank, but can we bring in other services within the footprint of the postal facility to offer more than what we're offering right now, and have that entity, that private entity, pay some of the freight there, since we already own a lot of these facilities, although I'm surprised to see how much we're still leasing. But I don't know. I'm just trying to multiply our competitive advantage where we can. Mr. Bernstock?
Yeah, Chairman Lynch, the greeting card test that we're running now is a very good indicator of what you're talking about. Before we went out and launched that, we went to consumers, and the feedback was that yes, they would be very pleased to have greeting cards offered in the Postal Service. They thought it was appropriate, and they would expect to purchase them there. So there's a whole range of other products that we could sell that we actually think would grow the market, and our customers would want those. In addition, beyond passports, we think there's a whole series of transactional activities we can be involved in. So I would agree there's a lot more we can do with the facilities that we have.
Yeah, I guess, and I appreciate that, and I know change is difficult.
Some would require changes in the law, some would not.
Okay. Well, we're happy to work with you and work with the postal employees as well to see what we can do. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I certainly agree that we've got to think big. I think part of the problem, though, is we don't think we'll like the answers that we get. It's kind of like everybody want to go to heaven, but nobody wants to die. And when I think of cost, I mean, we generate at one location, but then we spend at another one. I mean, we generate as people come in to purchase whatever it is that they're purchasing, but the output is as we maintain or try to maintain the concept of universal service. I know it's difficult to receive a piece of first-class mail. For example, if you live out on P.O. Box, like I used to live, where the carrier would go 5 miles before delivering another piece of mail. Well, I don't know how much you generate from the post office, as you sell whatever product you are selling. It seems to me that we've had some experiences and continue to have some experiences with bailouts. We've put resources into places. I think we have to do some serious thinking in relationship to what it is that we expect. I really don't want to have cancer and have somebody tell me I've got a sore. I don't want to have pneumonia and somebody have me believing or thinking that I've just got a cough. I got a little cold. So I agree that there are no shortcuts or easy routes or easy ways home. But I do think we're going to have to go for the big picture in terms of reevaluating our thinking relative to what it is that we want from our postal service. I never will forget a guy made a speech when I was in the 8th grade. He came to our school. And he said, I want you to ask yourselves 3 questions. 1, who am I? 2, what do I want? And 3, how do I propose to get it? And I think we're going to have to ask ourselves those three questions about our Postal Service. I'm a staunch union supporter, always have been, always will be. I believe that people should get the maximum of what can be received in terms of quality of life and expectation. But I also believe that there has to be realistic thinking in relationship to how do we manage a way to do that. If anyone would respond, I would appreciate it. If not, Mr. Chairman, I thank you very much for the opportunity.
I know they, have they just signaled votes? They have. What I'd like to do is recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly, for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair. Mr. Coughlin, I wonder, do you believe that the USPS has a culture of innovation? And if not, why not?
I think it has pockets of innovation, Mr. Chairman.
And I'm going to ask everyone, please speak into the microphone. I cannot hear you, believe it or not, up here.
I believe there are pockets of innovation within the Postal Service. I do believe that there are some conditions that exist, and I will say I don't think it's unique to the Postal Service. I think it's a characteristic of government generally that discourage risk-taking and discourage innovation, and they don't, and it doesn't generate an environment where innovation is expected on the part of employees.
Or rewarded.
I'm sorry?
Or rewarded, perhaps.
Well, that's a difficult issue as well, rewarded. But, I mean, I spent 32 years there. I think it's the greatest workforce in the world. There are some enormously creative people there, and they're going to need all of that creativity as they go forward. I do believe that Jack Potter and his team have done a terrific job in terms of generating an environment that encourages people to come forward with new ideas. And the move of bringing in people like Bob Bernstock and some of his colleagues to help support the traditional postal thinking has got to help in the long run. And I would, to go back to some of the chairman's comments earlier about the future, I wish I had an answer to what that business model ought to be. I don't right now. I do think that these things evolve over time. One of the things I mentioned in my testimony was I believe one of the possibilities is for the Postal Service down the road is in this nexus between their geographic physical presence and the communications technologies that are out there. And I think that's some of what, for example, the Swedish example you mentioned gets to. Yes and no is the answer to your question about innovation in the Postal Service.
Thank you. Ms. Golway, you intriguingly noted that the post office fleet is one of the largest in the country, and that in some ways, given the route structure, it's tailor-made for electrification and sort of talk about innovation, cutting-edge green technology being deployed. Could you expand a little bit on that? Have we done any studies that show how many pounds of CO2 and noxious gases could be avoided, what the energy savings could be?
This is an issue I ventured into just in January of this year, and I've discovered that there's a whole range of expertise far greater than mine. I do have many studies that I can forward to you about this. It appears that the Postal Service is ideally suited for transition to an electric vehicle fleet. Its current vehicles get about 8 to 12 miles to the gallon, and they're all at least 18 years old. Unfortunately, given the financial reality of the Postal Service, they don't have the capital to buy new vehicles, and I think it would be worthwhile to find funds in some of the other subsidies that are provided through the government and have those directed to the Postal Service so that they could invest in new vehicles, reduce some of their overhead, and lead the country in a national transformation.
Let me ask you, because I think we're onto something here. How many vehicles in the fleet?
150,000, although I think there may be maybe 140,000 now. They've reduced them a bit.
And any idea of what it would cost to replace them with electric vehicles?
Well, what I think the thinking is, and I believe that Congressman Serrano is working on some legislation, is to develop a program so that you phase in over 3 to 5 years enough vehicles with enough testing that you know exactly what to buy. But it's billions of dollars that are needed.
My time is about to expire, but I just want to pick up on your thought. It seems to me, Mr. Chairman, again, both Mr. Coughlin's, where he was pointing us to, we legislatively can look at how we can try to help foster a more innovative culture. We may be part of the problem. Secondly, with respect to what Chairwoman Golway is talking about, we were willing to put billions of dollars into cash for clunkers. Are we willing to invest in our own postal service to give it that cutting-edge, innovative delivery of services, to help make it more competitive, to give it the capital it lacks right now, and to do a good thing for the environment and for the auto industry while we're at it?
I think all of us on the table would support that effort and work with you to make sure that happens.
Thank you so much.
I thank the gentleman. I think this panel has suffered enough. We've actually got votes on the floor, but I did want to thank you for your willingness to come before the subcommittee and offer your thoughts and suggestions. We appreciate that. You're on the ground level where you can offer a unique perspective. I will hold the record open. I know there were several hearings going on this morning, so that my Republican colleagues could not all attend, so I'll leave the record open for their comments as well. But I want to thank you for your willingness to come forward and to help the committee with its work. Thank you very much. I bid you a good day.